to Wellness TV, where we discover all types of new health and wellness information and share it with our employees. I want to welcome you again to today's discussion, which will all be about kicking the sugar habit. So my name is John Redenberg. I am a registered dietitian and a diabetes educator in employee wellness. And we're also joined today by Anita Diaz, who is a dietetic intern with our office for the next 10 weeks. So she has graciously accepted this presentation with me, i.e. we asked her to be here because, she has to do what we say, right? But anyway, I digress. We are pleased to have you all on board joining us. We're going to share some very important information, both myself and Anita. And then at the end, I'm also going to share with you some information about a brand new challenge that we're starting on the 19th as a way to help you continue to earn credit towards your wellness premium discount. So first, let's start with sugar in general. So when we look at kicking the sugar habit, I think we all agree that sugar makes things taste awesome. Like if you had to find the most simplistic definition of what sugar actually does for us, it really enhances the flavor of the foods that we eat. And we all know this, and I think we all know that too much sugar isn't going to be great for our health. So I wanted to review with you some of what actually occurs when we consume sugar. So first things first, when we eat sugar, our body breaks it down into small individual units of energy, which we call glucose. And this may be a review for some of you, but what happens is as this glucose enters the bloodstream, insulin helps this glucose get into the cells. And when it's in the cells, that's where it's used for energy. But the issues can occur when we look at sugar consumption is if we're over consuming what is needed for that immediate source of energy. And as you all know, anything that we are eating that isn't going to be used for immediate energy is ultimately going to be stored as fat. So when we look at sugar consumption, we all have an amount that we should try to stay within. And we're going to share with you today some general guidelines as far as some targets to hit. But I wanted to kind of share with you this brief review of what happens when we consume sugar containing foods. Now, there is a difference between the types of sugar that are out there, natural occurring sugars, foods, sugar that we find in our fruits and our vegetables and our milk and our yogurt, and then of course the added sugars, and those are the things that we typically use to add sweetness to food or beverages. So your candies, your cakes, your cookies, your pies, all of those items are prime examples of added sugar. But the truth is, once your body breaks it down into those individual units of energy called glucose, it really had no idea where it came from. Where the health problems occur is if we consume too much sugar over the course of the day, whether it comes from naturally occurring sources or added sugar. However, and again, this is the catch, and this is why we typically don't talk badly of those natural occurring sugars, because the presence of fiber in a lot of these fruits and the vegetables that we consume, which are terrific sources of naturally occurring sugars, this slows down the absorption. So again, it makes it a little bit more beneficial to our health and well-being. So when we look at the challenge and what you're going to be faced with over the next several weeks as you do this challenge, a 2-week challenge, is really tracking that added sugar consumption. And what we know in terms of average sugar consumption over the course of the day, if you look at some of the population studies that have been done, it's right around 17 teaspoons per day. Now, that's about triple what's often suggested from health and well-being guidelines, but it actually has decreased over the years. So 17 teaspoons, yes, it's a lot, but overall per capita, when you look at average American intake, it's actually gone down somewhat. But again, these are statistics, and just like any statistic, it can be manipulated. I'm always reluctant to share averages because it can be misleading, because let's face it, if Bill Gates were to join this call, then on average, we'd all be rich. So make sure you put it in perspective when we look at and interpreting some of what these average numbers can mean. Now, the tricky thing is when we look at sugar, we all know it as many different names. So if we look at it in the back of an ingredients label, any one of these terms are actually just different words for sugar. And if we tried to rank them in terms of healthfulness, it ends up being a fruitless task. So I think long story short here is these are all pretty much considered added sugars when we see them on the nutrition label. So whether it's agave nectar or honey or dextrose or rice syrup, it's all going to be treated the same in the body with exception of a few metabolic pathways. But when we look at trying to reduce our sugar consumption, we're looking at any one of these additives. So there isn't the notion that honey is a healthier source of sugar than table sugar is not really based on any type of scientific evidence. So it's all going to be things that we need to try to be very careful with how much we use. Now, I will say this, that sugar, although it does appear in a lot of our foods and is a very popular additive, and we know it adds sweetness to our foods, it has some functions too in terms of healthfulness. And when I say help, I mean extending the shelf life. So sugar is a very popular additive because it adds texture to foods and can also help absorb some of the moisture. So that's the reason you'll see very small amounts of sugar in bread that you might buy in the grocery store, because it helps reduce the water activity, maintain the moisture, and help inhibit mold growth. So again, we don't have to go cold turkey when we say trying to target all added sugar in our diet. It's all about trying to make a conscious decision between finding food choices that your family already consumes and trying to find that with the most reasonable amount of sugar. So it does have some function in foods besides just adding sweetness. And even for those of you that go to the grocery store and have purchased bread from the bakery, you'll notice it doesn't last quite as long as the bread you might purchase this on the shelf, because oftentimes the fresh baked bread does not have the same, or if any, sugar added to it. So there's usually the difference there as far as shelf life goes. Now, it can be intimidating to know that there's all these different aliases for sugar, in trying to make healthful choices for you and your family. But the good news here is you don't have to be a chemist. You don't have to memorize that each of these are synonyms for sugar, because the new nutrition labels, when they were changed about 4 or 5 years ago, they actually denote what is the added sugar content in there. So it's less about really trying to navigate the different ingredients, but instead looking at the nutrition facts label so you can see exactly where added sugars might be found and at least how much. And Anita will walk you through some of those labels so you can see for yourself. Now, what we do know about sugar is that it can be addictive. All right. We look to sugar to relieve a lot of short-term stressors in our life. You ever had a stressful day at work and sat down and had a little bit of ice cream, and by a little bit I mean the entire gallon? That's a good example of using sugar to activate a strong dopamine response. It gives us that feeling of pleasure, that feeling of sensation that really makes us feel good. And as we continue to do this on a repetitive basis, we end up needing a little bit more of that substance, in this case sugar, to achieve the same response. And this is what really starts to drive some of those cravings. So when we look at sugar, the more you're consuming it, the more you're going to want it, and the more you're going to need to maintain that same dopamine response. I will tell you this, that there is a lot of debate in academics as whether or not sugar is as addictive as drugs. It does appeal to some of the same pleasure receptors that we see with drugs, but it's nowhere near as destructive. So the idea that sugar is just as addictive as heroin or things that are very destructive to our health and well-being, it's not really that significant. Okay, it has addictive properties, but it's not as dangerous as some of those obviously um, more harmful narcotics that we might find people exposed to on an ongoing basis. What we do know this, as we reduce our sugar intake, our brain can adapt and lower our tolerance for sugar, and we end up reducing that craving. So there are some steps that you can take in terms of trying to kick this sugar habit that we'll talk about at the end, but it all begins with raising awareness with how much you might need each day to stay healthy and where to find it in our foods. And for those parts, I'm going to turn the the microphone over to Anita.
Thank you, John. So these are a few of the recommendations out there regarding how much added sugar we should be consuming. The research is still ongoing, so these recommendations are updated over time as new research comes out. Currently, the American Heart Association recommends limiting added sugar intake to 6 teaspoons or 25 grams per day for women and children, and 9 teaspoons or 38 grams per day for men. Additionally, the Departments of Agriculture and Health and Human Services publish the Dietary Guidelines for Americans, which are updated every 5 years. And the 2020 to 2025 guidelines recommend limiting added sugar intake to less than 10% of total calories. So if you'd like to calculate that, you can take the number of calories you consume in a day. In this example, it's 1,800 calories and divide by 10. So you'd get 180 calories or less from added sugar. Then you can calculate how many grams that would be as well. So since sugar has 4 calories per gram, you would divide 180 calories from sugar by 4 calories per gram, and you would get 45 grams or less from added sugar. These are the current recommendations out there. And it's important to not only know these limits, but to also understand how to read food labels so you know how much added sugar you're consuming and you can track your intake. So that's what we will talk about next. Next slide, please. Here we go. Okay, so sorry. Okay, so this is the nutrition facts label that you should be able to find on most items in the grocery store, unless it's something like produce or something from the bakery or deli, it might not have the label. But you can see the sugars are listed under carbohydrates, and you'll see the 2 different numbers as John mentioned. The first number is the total sugars. This is the amount of naturally occurring sugars and added sugars combined to give you the total amount of sugar in the item. And then below that, you'll see added sugars. This number represents only sugar that was added to the item during processing and is not naturally occurring. This is the number that you want to look for when you're tracking your added sugar intake. So in this example, you can see that the total sugars are 37 grams and the added sugars are 18 grams. This label is actually from a bottle of chocolate milk. So there were 18 grams of sugar added to the chocolate milk, and the remaining 19 grams of total sugar is from the lactose sugar that's naturally occurring in the milk. And this is an example of a nutrition label on a granola bar. You can see that the total sugars are 6 grams and the added sugars are also 6 grams. So all of the sugar in this granola bar is added sugar. There's no naturally occurring sugar here. And additionally, if you look at the ingredients list down in the bottom right corner, you can see an example of how sugar can show up under many different names in the ingredients. So this granola bar has 5 different sugars in the ingredients. As you start to read food labels and nutrition facts for added sugar, you may notice some other packaging terms related to a product's sugar content, and it's important to understand what those mean. For example, you may see reduced sugar or lower sugar, and this means that the product contains at least 25% less sugar than the traditional variety for the same serving size. So this Heinz ketchup is reduced sugar. It will still contain added sugars. However, it'll be less than the same ketchup that's not labeled as reduced sugar. You may also see no sugar added, which means that there was no sugar or sugar-containing ingredients added to the product during processing. This does not mean there is no sugar. It just means that any sugar present would be naturally occurring. And lastly, we have sugar-free, which means the product has less than 0.5 grams of sugar, so a very, very small amount, and it does not contain sugar as an ingredient. Something that's important to mention when talking about no sugar added and sugar-free, and possibly even reduced sugar too, is that these products may contain sugar substitutes, and that's how they're able to produce a sweetened product without sugar. So we will talk about sugar substitutes next. All right, so sugar substitutes are sweeteners that usually contain 0 calories or only a few calories, and they have no nutritional value. They don't have any carbohydrates, no protein, no fat, no vitamins and minerals. And another term for this is non-nutritive sweeteners. Some of the sugar substitutes you're probably familiar with are things like Splenda, Sweet and Low, Equal, Acylflame potassium or Acylfame K is commonly used in a lot of diet sodas or zero sodas, as is aspartame. And sugar substitutes even include some of the more natural sugar alternatives like stevia or monk fruit. So the reason we want to talk about sugar substitutes is because it might seem like a good idea to just replace added sugar with a sugar substitute. However, the research is indicating that sugar substitutes are actually linked to some undesirable outcomes like weight gain, metabolic syndrome, cardiac events, and even diabetes. So before swapping all added sugars for sugar substitutes, you might want to consider some of the other ways to reduce your added sugar intake and meet with a doctor or a registered dietitian to discuss how sugar substitutes may fit into your diet and if they're appropriate for you. Now we're going to talk about some of the things you can do to reduce your added sugar intake and actually kick that sugar habit. So the first thing you can do is to remove table sugar. Think about anywhere you might be adding table sugar, whether it's in your coffee or your cereal, and try to find an alternative to the table sugar. If you usually add table sugar into your coffee, you can try reducing the amount slowly over time until eventually you don't need it anymore. You can also try adding some flavorings like vanilla extract or cinnamon to your coffee to add some sweetness without any added sugar. For cereal, you can use fruit instead of sugar to add more sweetness and flavor, and this will also add some bonus fiber as well. You can swap sugary sodas and fruit juices for water. It could be flavored water, infused water, sparkling water, whatever you enjoy as long as it doesn't have added sugar. You can also try unsweetened teas and try adding some fresh or frozen fruit to the tea for more flavor. You will definitely want to read labels whenever you can and try to choose products with less added sugar if possible. Explore spices and extract. I mentioned this for coffee, but this could be for anything that you want to add some sweetness to. So it could be yogurt, smoothies, or you can even add it to plain fruit just to add some more flavor. When you do consume sweets with added sugar, savoring smaller portion sizes will allow you to indulge in that sweet treat while minimizing the amount of added sugar you consume. And something that's really important for reducing sugar cravings is to eat consistently and not skip meals. I know it's easy to get caught up in the workday and work straight through lunch without eating, but skipping meals can lead to feeling excessively hungry and can lead to more sugar cravings. When you're excessively hungry and experiencing those cravings, it's so tempting to just reach for the sugary foods. So make sure you're not skipping meals, and this will prevent that from happening. Getting adequate sleep can actually decrease cravings as well because it can impact your hunger and fullness hormones. So when you don't get enough sleep, your body increases a hormone called ghrelin. Kind of sounds like gremlin because you're like a gremlin when you're super hungry. And this is your hunger hormone. This will cause you to feel way hungrier. You'll be more likely to experience sugar cravings and reach for those sugary foods. So getting sleep can help prevent that, as can drinking lots of water can help as well. Proper hydration can stabilize your blood sugars, which will prevent sugar cravings. And lastly, planning and prepping is so important for kicking the sugar habit. You want to make sure you're prepared with meals and snacks so there's no guesswork. It's easy to reach for the healthy choices, and you're not left making decisions at the last minute when you're already super hungry and wanting anything and everything. So these are some of the things you can try to kick the sugar habit. You can explore these options as well as others and find whatever works best for you. And down here at the bottom, we have a list of foods that commonly contain hidden added sugars. So we recommend becoming a sugar sleuth and examining all of these food items for added sugars before purchasing them so you know what you're buying and if it has added sugars or not. Some of them are kind of surprising, like pasta sauces and condiments. So just make sure you're reading all of your labels so you know what you're getting. Now I will turn it back to John so he can introduce the Sugar Busters Challenge.
All right, thank you, Anita. That's great information. We identified those particular foods because when we go through the supermarket and really start to study some of these nutrition facts labels, this is where we see a lot of sugar hiding in some significant quantities. And you'll also see a lot of variability in different types of these foods, from cereals to granola bars to fruit bars to pasta sauces. So part of our challenge would be to try to identify those choices that are a little bit lower on that spectrum in terms of overall sugar. So we have a Sugar Busters challenge. As I said, we'll start June 19th through July 3rd. I just put into the chat the tracking sheet that we will use. We will also be sharing this through our typical wellness media channels through our newsletter. So if you can't quite access it right now, don't worry, there'll be plenty of opportunities to find it on our website. But how the challenge works is pretty straightforward. You're going to track your added sugar intake over the course of 2 weeks, and take notice how tracking this sugar intake might gradually force you to make some reductions. So you'll simply put the date right over here on this line, and then as you move through your day, you'll slowly shade in how much added sugar you're consuming, and then put your daily total here. The aspect of this challenge is just to raise awareness on where added sugar might be hiding in your particular diet. So we're not saying that you have to meet a certain threshold. We're not grading this. This isn't like a fantasy football roster where we're going to award the highest sugar count or the lowest sugar count. It's all about trying to raise awareness of added sugar consumption. On the other side of the tracking sheet, you'll also notice some healthful low sugar recipes for some of the dessert items and beverage choices out there. So, use that as you see fit. So all we ask you to do is put your name and your employee ID number on this and submit it to Wellness. You'll get not just 50 points to your wellness credit, but for those of you that are in Jacksonville, we're going to make a random drawing of all the tracking sheets that we collect and award one winner a Magic Bullet 17-piece smoothie mixer set. So this is just an added perk for participating in this particular challenge. Again, it's going to start June 19th and run through July 3rd. So lots of ways to kind of track your sugar intake and raise awareness of what you're actually consuming. Now, you might be asking, is that, well, not everything that I eat has a nutrition facts label and doesn't have that information. That's true. There are some online resources that you can consult. So you can use MyFitnessPal, which is a very popular app that will inform you about potential added sugar in a food item you might select. There's another website that I'll put in the chat called CalorieKing.com. That's another way to find out information about foods you might eat, that how much added sugar it could contain. And remember, you're not writing the individual food items on this sheet. We're not going to, Nita and myself and Krupa, we're not going to grade these and evaluate them based on accuracy. This is just really just to raise your own personal awareness of sugar intake. Good question in the chat here. The deadline date to submit the tracking form, we haven't established a hard guideline, but I think we'd like to have it back by the end of the week. So if you can get it to us by July 7th, we can call that the fair deadline to be eligible to win the raffle for the Magic Bullet. But really, you'll have a couple of weeks after that to get it in for wellness credit. Now, the sooner you get it to us after July 3rd, the sooner we can also get those points added to your wellness credit profile. But we'll put a deadline for the raffle as July 7th. So good question there. So thank you for asking that. So learned a lot about sugar, where to find it, some strategies to help perhaps kick that habit and reduce your consumption. But if there's any other questions, both myself and Anita will be hanging out here in the virtual chat. Feel free to add those questions or unmute yourself, and we'll be happy to help. But until next time, thank you for joining us for another session of Wellness TV.
Can I ask you one question, please?
Yes.
I think this is wonderful information. And prior to COVID, we also had an opportunity where we were able to do Weight Watchers, which is supported by UF, in the building.
Yes.
Do you think anything like that will be coming back?
I can ask. That's a good question. So we have routine calls with WW or Weight Watchers, and I know they had restricted a lot of their worksite coaches because of the pandemic, but I need to check base with them to see if that's something that they're going to bring back in their portfolio. So I will look into that to see what we can do to make that happen again. So great question.
We had another question, John, about walking after meals. Do you want to take that one or do you want me to answer it?
Well, yeah. So, I mean, as far as what type of question about walking, I think it's a great thing to do after your meals. I always tell people that attend our diabetes workshops, if you're familiar with the drug metformin, which is used to help lower blood sugar, it helps move glucose back into the cells when insulin isn't doing its job effectively, but it's also the same mechanism of action as physical activity. So we look at walking as Mother Nature's metformin, if you will. So if you're looking for another reason to get moving and to help shuttle any sugar you've consumed into a cell where it can be used immediately for energy, I would wholeheartedly recommend walking after a meal. I hope
have
that
another
answers the
question.
questions. Yes,
It did. Thank you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
I'm watching some lady, I think she's called the Glucose Goddess on YouTube, and some of the, let's say, hacks. One of them was, I think, eating your vegetables first at a meal. She said coats the inside of your, whatever, your veins or whatever. So when you eat the sugar, the dessert last, it is more protective, was one hack. And then another hack was drinking apple cider vinegar water before a meal. Have you heard of either of those?
I've heard it's kind of, those are examples of like where one kernel of a truth can kind of get expanded to a point where it's maybe no longer beneficial. So here's what we know about dietary fiber. So dietary fiber can delay the absorption of glucose into the bloodstream and therefore slow down that flood of glucose that can kind of overwhelm our own natural insulin response. So yes, by consuming vegetables or really anything with dietary fiber, that would add more fiber to that meal and then slow down the absorption of glucose that comes from any following dessert. Now, doesn't mean it won't get absorbed, doesn't mean it won't be digested, but it just means that there'll be maybe a smaller impact on a person's individual blood sugar. So I wouldn't look at that as a strategy to kind of justify over consuming sugar, if that makes sense. So I think that would,
Correct.
yeah, I would look to that piece of advice as being somewhat kind of bogus. And then as far as apple cider vinegar goes, it's something that's very popular. And again, Krupa, if you want to chime in, or Anita, if you've heard something different, the only research I've seen in terms of nutrition is that the consumption of apple cider vinegar does seem to depress a person's appetite. So obviously, if you're not as hungry, you're not going to eat as much. But as far as really impacting the metabolism of other accompanying foods, I haven't seen much. I do know it can lead to, your dentist isn't going to like that because it's going to really break down your tooth enamel. But outside of anything beyond that, it's not something that I would recommend.
Thanks.
So a good point was brought to my attention in terms of when we look at simple sugars. So things like bagels and bread and white rice, and even consuming these types of starches, which are quickly converted to sugar, can be potentially problematic too. So it's important to keep those in mind. Remember, fiber can be our friend. So that's why you always see recommendations to try to go to whole grain for those types of simpler carbohydrates because they're absorbed more slowly. They help us feel fuller longer and do a good job at helping reduce overconsumption of some of those types of foods. And I would be remiss if I also didn't remind everyone that's on this call that nutrition counseling is available at no charge to you. So if this is something that you want to talk individually with the dietitian about, Krupa will be glad to lead that charge. We've got appointment information on our website on the bridge. You can just kind of go to the pick a time link and pick a time that you want to chat about food, and we'd be there to help you. All right, well, we'll still hang out here in cyberspace. So if anything comes up, just throw it in the